the uninvited guest. It was the kind of night that starts off perfect, where everything feels like it's falling into place. I had just moved into my new house, a small but charming place in the suburbs of Chicago. After months of searching, I'd found a house that didn't drain my savings and still had character, an old craftsman-style home with creaky wooden floors and vintage windows. It was the kind of place that, despite its age, felt like it had a soul. To celebrate, I invited a few close friends over. The group was small, just how I liked it. There was Sarah, my best friend from college, who had been my rock through all the ups and downs of finding the place. Then there was Chris and his girlfriend Amanda, who had moved into the same neighborhood not too long ago. Rounding out the group was Tyler, my coworker, and probably one of the funniest guys I knew. It wasn't a huge crowd, but that was the point. We could laugh, drink, and talk without things getting out of hand. The evening started off perfectly. The house was warm with the soft glow of lamps, and the smell of pizza filled the air. The laughter came easily as we talked about old memories, embarrassing moments, and shared inside jokes. The whole thing had that light, carefree energy that makes you forget about work or responsibilities. It was supposed to be a celebration, just a few close friends enjoying a quiet night in my new home. But then someone knocked on the door. It wasn't particularly late yet, maybe around 9 p.m. At first I thought it was one of the neighbors stopping by to introduce themselves, or maybe someone who had the wrong address. But when I opened the door, there was a man standing there, a stranger I didn't recognize. He was tall, lanky, with messy brown hair that looked like it hadn't been cut in months. His clothes were casual, but not dirty, just unremarkable. He had that kind of look where you might think I've seen him somewhere before but can't quite place it. "Hey," he said, with a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here for the party." I blinked. Party? It wasn't like this was some big event, and everyone I'd invited was already inside. "I think you've got the wrong house," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. "It's just a small thing with some friends." He didn't move. Instead, he looked past me into the house, where I could hear the others laughing in the living room. "I'm a friend of Tyler's," he said. "He invited me. Said you wouldn't mind." I hesitated. That seemed weird. Tyler had never mentioned inviting anyone else, and we talked about keeping it low-key. But before I could respond, the guy gave me this awkward grin, like he could see the gears turning in my head. "You know how Tyler is," he added, as if that explained everything. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him in. There was something about his confidence, the way he just inserted himself into the situation, that made it hard to argue. Maybe he was a friend of Tyler's. Maybe I was being overly cautious. When we walked into the living room, Tyler raised his head, and for just a moment there was this flicker of surprise on his face. He masked it quickly with a wide grin. "Oh, hey man," Tyler said, standing up to shake his hand. "Glad you could make it." The stranger nodded, his eyes sweeping across the room as he introduced himself. "I'm Nick." I noticed the way Nick's gaze lingered just a second too long on each of my friends, like he was studying them. Something about it sent a chill down my spine. But the mood stayed light, and no one else seemed bothered. We continued chatting, joking around, and drinking, though I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, Nick remained relatively quiet. He sat on the edge of the couch, smiling when the others laughed but never really engaging in the conversation. Occasionally I'd catch him looking at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, as if he was waiting for something. It was unsettling, but I kept brushing it off. Maybe he was just shy or introverted, but that didn't explain the way his presence seemed to shift the energy in the room. At one point, Sarah leaned over to me and whispered, "Do you know that guy? He's kind of weird." "I don't know," I admitted. "He says he's a friend of Tyler's." Sarah's brow furrowed, but she didn't say anything more. Still, I could tell she was getting the same vibe I was. There was something about Nick that just didn't fit. He was like a puzzle piece from a different set, and the more I watched him, the more I felt like something was very, very wrong. A few hours passed and people started to wind down. Chris and Amanda said their goodbyes first, hugging everyone before heading out the door. I thought about asking Tyler if Nick was really his friend, but something held me back. The atmosphere had shifted. The warmth that had filled the house earlier was gone, replaced with a cold tension that seemed to settle in the corners of the room. It was close to midnight when Sarah announced that she was going to head home too. She gave me a tight smile, her eyes darting briefly to Nick before she hugged me. "Call me tomorrow, okay?" she said quietly. There was a note of concern in her voice that I didn't miss. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sure." Sarah left, and now it was just me, Tyler, and Nick. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and the silence between the three of us was uncomfortable. Tyler had gotten quieter, glancing at Nick every so often with a look I couldn't quite read. I was about to suggest that we call it a night when Nick stood up abruptly. "I should get going," he said. Relief flooded through me. "Yeah, sure. Thanks for coming," I replied, eager to see him leave. But then he paused by the front door, his hand resting on the doorknob as he turned to face me. His eyes were sharp now, focused, like he was about to say something important. "You have a nice place here," he said, his voice lower than before. "It feels lived in." The way he said it made my skin crawl. Before I could respond, he opened the door and walked out into the night without another word. The door clicked shut, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "What the hell was that about?" I asked, turning to Tyler. Tyler's face was pale, his expression tense. I didn't invite him," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know him." The room seemed to spin. "What?" "I thought maybe you did," Tyler continued, running a hand through his hair. "When he showed up and acted like he knew me, I just played along. I didn't want to make it awkward in front of everyone. But I swear to you, I've never seen that guy in my life." A cold chill crept down my spine. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. Nick had just walked into my house, pretended to know Tyler, and we'd let him in. He'd spent the entire night with us, listening, watching. And now I had no idea who he was or what he wanted. Suddenly my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from Sarah. "Hey, I think someone's following me. That guy, Nick. I saw him when I turned onto my street. Should I call the police?" My blood turned to ice. I stared at the message, my mind racing. What did he want? Why had he been at my house? And why was he following Sarah? Without thinking, I dialed her number, my hands shaking as I waited for her to pick up. "Sarah," I said, my voice frantic. "Where are you?" "I'm almost home," she replied, her voice trembling. "He's still behind me." "Oh my God, Matt, he's pulling over." The line went dead. For a moment I stood there in shock, the silence of the house pressing down on me. Then, without a word, I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, Tyler close behind me. I didn't know who Nick was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear: he wasn't done with us. The night shift. Working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store was not what I imagined I'd be doing after finishing high school, but here I was, alone in the dead of night at a quick stop just outside of Indianapolis. It wasn't a bad job, really. Most nights were uneventful, just a few truckers stopping by for coffee and smokes, or the occasional late-night snack run from students at the nearby community college. But things had changed about a month ago. It was hard to explain at first, but the store didn't feel the same. I could sense it as soon as I clocked in, an eerie stillness that settled over the aisles once the last customer of the evening left. At first, I chalked it up to the loneliness of the job. It wasn't like I had anyone to talk to after midnight, and the radio barely picked up any stations that late. But then there was the bell. The front door had a little bell that rang every time someone walked in. It was an old-school thing, installed back when the store was first built in the 80s. You could hear that bell all the way in the back, in the storeroom. where I often went to rest dock or take a quick break. It was the kind of sound you got used to over time until it started going off on its own. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was around 2 a.m., and I was in the back stocking up the shelves with chips when I heard the bell. I grabbed a fresh pack of cigarettes to restock the front and headed out to the counter. "Good evening," I called out, expecting to see a tired trucker or a bleary-eyed student standing at the counter. But the store was empty. I frowned and checked the security monitor behind the counter. It showed the front door was closed and no one had come in. Strange, I thought, but maybe the wind had set the bell off. It was cold outside and the door was old, just like everything else in the store. Still, I couldn't shake the weird feeling. I walked around the aisles, checking to see if someone had slipped in without me noticing. But there was no one. Just rows of snacks, drinks, and cleaning supplies, all in their place. I went back to the counter, glancing at the clock. 2:05 a.m. It was going to be a long night. The next few shifts were quiet. But a week later, the bell rang again. This time it was around 3 a.m., and I was sitting at the register, flipping through a magazine, trying to keep myself awake. The bell's sharp ring cut through the silence of the store, jolting me upright. I looked up immediately, expecting to see someone. Again, no one. I got up, my heart racing a little faster this time. I stepped outside into the cold night air, expecting to find someone lingering around the gas pumps, or maybe hiding in one of the blind spots near the dumpsters. But the parking lot was empty, illuminated only by the dim glow of the overhead lights. Not a soul in sight. I went back inside, trying to push the growing unease from my mind. The store felt different now, quieter somehow. I told myself it was just late, that I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every creak of the floor or flicker of the lights made me jump, and by the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was more than ready to leave. The next night it got worse. I was in the middle of organizing the drinks cooler when the bell rang again. I froze, the cold from the freezer biting into my skin as I listened. The store was silent, except for the hum of the refrigeration unit. I slowly closed the door to the cooler and stepped out into the main area, scanning the aisles. Again, there was no one. The door hadn't opened, but the bell had definitely rung. I walked up to the front counter, staring at the door as if willing it to reveal some kind of logical explanation. My eyes flicked to the security monitor. The front door was closed. No one had entered. I was about to chalk it up to a faulty bell when I heard a sound from the back of the store. It was a soft rustling, like something shifting on the shelves. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously made my way toward the noise, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the end of the aisle, I stopped. A can of soup had fallen off the shelf, rolling slowly across the floor. I stared at it, waiting for some kind of rational explanation to come to mind. Maybe it had just been stacked poorly. Maybe the vibrations from the refrigeration unit had knocked it over. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As I bent down to pick up the can, I heard another thud. I whipped my head around just in time to see a bag of chips tumble from the shelf behind me. Then another, and another. One by one, items began falling off the shelves, as if an invisible hand was knocking them over. The rustling grew louder, echoing through the empty store, and my breath caught in my throat. I backed up toward the counter, my eyes darting around the aisles, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something that could be explained away by a faulty door or the creaks of an old building. I grabbed my phone from the counter and called my boss, Brad. He was a gruff guy, always quick to dismiss complaints and slow to offer solutions. When he answered, I could tell I'd woken him up. "Yeah, what is it?" he grumbled. "Brad, something's wrong here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The bell keeps ringing, but no one's coming in. And now, things are falling off the shelves." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Brad sighed. "It's an old building, Nate. Stuff like that happens. The wind probably knocked the door or something. Just put the stuff back and stop freaking out." But it's not just the wind, I started to argue, but Brad cut me off. Look, it's 3 in the morning. Unless there's a fire or someone's robbing the place, I don't want to hear about it. Got it? He hung up before I could say anything else. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in disbelief. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I'd seen and heard. And it wasn't just the wind. I walked back to the shelves, my hands shaking as I picked up the fallen items and placed them back where they belonged. The store was quiet again, but the air felt thick with tension. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, waiting for anything to happen. I made it through the rest of the night without any more disturbances, but the unease never left. When my shift ended, I practically ran out of the store, eager to get away from whatever had been messing with me. The following night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. I'd heard stories about haunted buildings before, but I never believed in that kind of thing. Ghosts, spirits, it all seemed like nonsense. But now I wasn't so sure. Whatever was happening in that store, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone. Something was there with me, watching, waiting, and I had no idea what it wanted. I handed in my notice the next day. Brad wasn't happy about it, but I didn't care. I wasn't sticking around to find out what would happen next. Some places, I realized, just aren't meant to be disturbed. And that store, with its creaky floors, flickering lights, and echoing bell, was one of them. Echoes of the steps. It was a crisp autumn evening when I first noticed it. The leaves outside my old Victorian house rustled underfoot as I walked to my front door. I had just moved in, a fresh start after the whirlwind of a breakup, and a new job at a small town outside of Chicago. The house was charming in its own way, with its high ceilings, ornate moldings, and creaky wooden floors that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. It was the kind of place that felt like it held 100 stories within its walls. That first night I had settled in, unpacked a few boxes, and was preparing to take a bath when I heard the faint echo of my own footsteps. It was odd, but not alarming at first. I chalked it up to the house settling or the acoustics playing tricks on me. After all, it was a big old place, and every house has its quirks. But as the days went by, the phenomenon persisted. Each time I walked through the house, I'd hear a perfectly timed duplication of my steps, as though someone or something was mimicking my movements. I'd test it by walking slowly, then quickly, and always, without fail, there was that soft, insistent echo. It was unnerving but not terrifying. Yet there was something disquieting about it, a sense of being watched or followed even when I was alone. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house's way of getting used to me. But then the echoes began to change. It wasn't just a repetition of my steps. Sometimes I would hear the echo walk in time with me, but not in perfect sync. It would lag behind or rush ahead, and other times it would sound like someone else was walking with me, though I could see no one. It was as if the house had a presence that shadowed me, its rhythm almost mocking in its inconsistency. One evening, as I was rearranging the living room, I decided to confront it. I moved a chair and sat down, trying to listen for any irregularities. The echo returned as usual, but this time it sounded different, more deliberate. It wasn't just repeating my steps, it felt like it was trying to communicate, like a shadowy figure was moving in tandem with me. I tried to get a handle on the situation by setting up some recording equipment. I set up a small digital recorder in the hallway where the echoes were the loudest. I hoped that capturing it on tape might provide some answers, or at least make me feel less crazy. That night, after setting the recorder, I went to bed early, exhausted from a long day at work. I fell asleep quickly, but my rest was disturbed by a dream that seemed all too real. I was walking down the same hallway, but this time it was dark, and the echoes were louder, more oppressive. I felt a presence behind me, always just out of sight. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The night was eerily quiet. I got up and walked to the hallway to check the recorder. When I played back the audio, I expected to hear the usual faint echo. Instead, I was met with a cacophony of sound, my footsteps, yes, but also a distorted, garbled noise, like someone trying to speak but unable to form words. My unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was mimicking my steps wasn't just an echo. It was something more sinister, something with intent. I decided to seek help. I called the local historian, hoping that the old house might have some dark past that could explain the strange occurrences. Mrs. Hawkins, the local historian, was a kind, elderly woman who had lived in the town her whole life. When I described my experiences, her face grew serious. She sat me down at her kitchen table and began to recount the house's history. "It's a beautiful house," she began, "but it's had its share of tragedies." She told me that the house had been built in the early 1900s by a wealthy family who had lived there for decades. But then, the head of the household had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed he had vanished without a trace, while others whispered that he had been murdered, his body never found. After that, the house changed hands several times, with each new owner reporting strange occurrences before quickly moving out. The story chilled me to the bone. I began to wonder if the echoes were more than just a peculiar quirk of the house. Was there something left behind, a spirit perhaps, mimicking my every move? That night, I decided to confront whatever was in the house directly. I waited until midnight, when the house was silent, and I walked the hallways deliberately. I wanted to see if the echoes would change or if I could somehow provoke a response. As I walked, I spoke aloud, addressing the presence I felt. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know why you're here, but I'm not afraid of you." The echoes responded almost immediately, the steps matching mine exactly. But then, the rhythm shifted. It became erratic, uneven. It felt like something was moving in the shadows, getting closer and then retreating, as if it were toying with me. I reached the hallway where the echoes were the loudest. I could almost feel a pressure in the air, a tangible sense of dread. I looked around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just empty rooms and the oppressive silence of the house. Suddenly the temperature dropped, and I felt an icy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The echoes grew louder, more frantic. It felt as though the presence was right behind me, its breath cold on my neck. In a panic, I ran back to my bedroom and locked the door. I could still hear the echoes, growing louder and more chaotic. The footsteps were now in a frenzy, a cacophony of sound that seemed to engulf me. I felt trapped, my own home turning into a prison of sound and shadow. Desperate for help, I called Mrs. Hawkins again. I explained the situation, my voice shaking. "I need help. I don't know what's happening, but I can't stay here anymore." She promised to come over the next morning with some supplies to help cleanse the house. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with fear and anticipation. The echoes continued, a constant reminder of the unseen presence lurking in the shadows. The next day, Mrs. Hawkins arrived with a small team and various spiritual cleansing tools. She led me through the house, explaining what she was doing as she worked. They used sage to purify the space, chanted prayers, and performed rituals to drive away any lingering spirits. As they worked, the echoes began to fade. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the air seemed to clear. By the time they finished, the house felt lighter, the atmosphere less charged. The echoes were gone. I was relieved but still shaken. The experience had left me with more questions than answers. What had been mimicking my steps? Why had it chosen me? And why did it seem to intensify the more I confronted it? I stayed in the house for a few more weeks, and although the echoes never returned, the experience left me wary. I was constantly aware of every creak and groan of the old house, my senses heightened to any sign of disturbance. As time went on, I became accustomed to the quirks of my new home. The echoes were gone, but the memory of that unsettling presence remained. The house had its charm, but it also held a lingering sense of mystery. I never did find out what the echoes truly were. Perhaps it was a spirit of the past, trapped in the house and bound to mimic every step of those who lived there. Or maybe it was something more abstract, a manifestation of the house's history and the fears of its occupants. Either way, I learned to live with the whispers of the past and the echoes of my own footsteps. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows stretch long, I can still hear the faintest hint of those echoes, a reminder that some things in life are better left unexplained. Charles Manson and the Cult of the Apocalypse. I never thought that a story I had been scared of as a child would become my reality. Charles Manson and his sinister cult were just shadows of the past. I believed myths our parents told us to keep us from falling in with the wrong crowd. But one day I saw Manson's legacy emerge from those shadows and slip into my life. It all started in the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a quiet retreat in California. I needed solitude, a break from the noise of the city and the pressures of society. The place seemed perfect, an old farm surrounded by hills. It was a kind of hippie commune where people came to find spiritual harmony. A small group of people greeted me at the gate, young, smiling, slightly odd. I didn't think much of it. We're all searching for something, some for peace, others for answers. On the first evening, I met the leader of the group. His name was Daniel. There was something unsettling about him. His soft voice, his confident gestures, he spoke in a way that felt like he was reading your mind, like he knew more about you than you did. After a few days, I began to notice something strange. Daniel often spoke about a new world that was about to arrive. He talked about some impending event that would completely change humanity. He called it the dawn and insisted that we must prepare for its arrival. This sounded eerily similar to stories I had heard about Charles Manson, the ones that terrified me when I was younger. But surely no one still believed in his teachings in 2019, right? One night I woke up to a strange noise. A rustling like footsteps came from outside my window. I looked out and saw a group of people walking toward an old barn door. They were carrying candles and strange symbols adorned their clothing. My heart froze. There was something deeply sinister in this, but I couldn't move. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear. The next morning, no one mentioned the night's events. Everything seemed as calm as ever. People smiled, played guitars, chatted. But now, their smiles seemed forced to me. One day, Daniel invited me for a private meeting. We sat in a small room, lit by a single candle, as he began to speak of the past. He talked about Manson as if he had known him personally. He described him not as a criminal, but as a prophet who understood the true nature of the world. Daniel believed that Charles Manson had been right, the end of the world was near, and his cult was only the beginning. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his eyes piercing through me. "We all feel it. It's just a matter of time." I froze. Every nerve in my body screamed that I needed to get out, but I couldn't move. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. That evening, I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't stay in that place any longer. But when I tried to leave the commune, a few people blocked my path. They didn't threaten me outright, but their faces were serious. "You don't understand what we're trying to do," one of them said. "Daniel is going to lead us into the new world. You just need to wait for the dawn." The next few days were pure torment. I was a prisoner, though not physically. They didn't lock me in, but leaving was impossible. Fear gripped me. I tried to hide in my room, avoiding contact with anyone, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed on me. The people became more aggressive. They spoke of sacrifices, of the need to eliminate the enemies of the new world. They no longer hid their fanatical beliefs. One night I decided to escape. I waited until everyone was asleep and sneaked out to my car. But just as I started the engine, Daniel stepped out of the shadows. He stood right in front of my car, smiling. His smile no longer seemed friendly. It was a cold, menacing grin. "You don't understand," he said. "You're already part of this. You can't leave." I bolted from the car and ran into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out. My mind was racing, fragments of words about the new world, the coming dawn, and the sacrifices. In that moment, I realized they were ready to kill. Like Manson, Daniel believed that murder was just a step toward their goal. At dawn, I stumbled upon a road and managed to flag down a passing car. The driver, an elderly man, looked at me like I was crazy as I tried to explain what had happened. I was speaking too fast, too erratically, but he helped me anyway. We drove to the nearest town, and I finally felt safe. But even after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. That cult, those people, they were real. Fanaticism, as I had learned, doesn't die, it just waits. A few months later, I saw a news report about the place. People from Daniel's commune had been arrested after authorities found evidence of planned ritualistic killings. I wasn't surprised, but what struck me was that not everyone had been caught. Daniel wasn't among those arrested. Sometimes I think I see him. In a crowd on the street, in a cafe, or at a train station. His face is always in the shadows, but I can feel his presence. I know he's still out there. Like Charles Manson, he continues to live in the minds of those who believe in his words. I thought I had escaped the horror, but the fear, as it turned out, wasn't in what happened. The real terror is in realizing that the fanaticism I saw never dies. It just hides in people willing to follow a madman. Manson isn't just a man from the past. He's an idea that still lives among us, and any one of us could be its next victim. I knew Charles Manson was terrifying, but I never thought his legacy would come so close to my own life. The Bell Witch Haunting. You never expect to encounter real fear when you're from a place like Adams, Tennessee. It's a small, quiet town, the kind of place where nothing seems to change. My family had lived here for generations, and the Bell family even longer. I knew the legends, of course. Everyone does. The story of the Bell Witch, the malevolent spirit that supposedly haunted the Bell family back in the early 1800s. It's one of those tales that kids tell around campfires to scare each other. But like most locals, I never believed it. Not until I came face to face with something I still can't explain. I grew up on a farm not far from where the Bell family's land had once stood. My parents told me the legends when I was a child, but it was always with a smile, like a harmless piece of folklore. People just like to scare themselves, my father would say. He never talked about the fact that some of our own ancestors had known the Bells. He avoided the topic, like everyone did, until I got older. When I turned 23, my parents passed away, leaving me the family farm. I was their only child, and I had come to love the place, even if it felt lonely at times. The house itself was old, creaking with age, but I never thought it was anything more than that. There were no strange noises, no eerie footsteps, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards underfoot. That all changed one cold night in October. The first incident. I had been asleep, and I remember waking up to the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind. The windows rattled during storms, and this felt like one of those nights. I turned over, pulling the blankets tighter, but the knocking didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, and then 3 more. I got up thinking someone was at the door, maybe a neighbor in trouble. But when I opened the front door, no one was there. The night was still, the moon casting an eerie glow over the empty fields. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and I quickly shut the door, telling myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The knocking came again the next night, and the night after that. Always at the same time, always in the same pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. After a week of this, I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I called the police, thinking maybe it was some local kids messing with me. They came out, checked the area, but found no footprints, no signs that anyone had been on the property. That's when I started thinking about the old stories. The Bell Witch returns. The legend of the Bell Witch had haunted this town for centuries. The story goes that John Bell, the patriarch of the Bell family, had angered a local woman named Kate Batts, and she had cursed him and his family. After that, strange things started happening. The Bell Witch, as she became known, tormented the family for years. She whispered in their ears at night, pulled their blankets from their beds, and even slapped John Bell's children. Eventually, the spirit was said to have killed John Bell himself, poisoning him. The part that always stuck with me, though, was that the Bell Witch had promised to return, and every few generations people claimed to experience something strange on or near the old Bell property. I didn't want to believe it, but as the weeks went by, the knocking turned into something worse. The haunting intensifies. One night I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself by watching TV. The air was thick, heavy with that oppressive silence that had become all too familiar. Suddenly I heard something upstairs. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the hallway above me. I froze. The farm was old, sure, but those weren't the creaks of the house settling. It was the sound of someone or something walking. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs. Every step felt like it took forever, my mind racing with every possibility. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw nothing, no one. But the air up there was colder, so much colder than it should have been. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for the first time I felt a presence. It was as if something was watching me, something malevolent. I checked every room, my hands trembling. Nothing was out of place, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave. When I went back downstairs, the knocking started again, louder this time. I slammed my fist against the doorframe, trying to shake off the fear, but deep down I knew the legend was real. The Bell Witch had returned. The dark secrets. I started researching everything I could about the Bell family. I knew the basics from local folklore, but there were details I had never bothered to learn. As I dug deeper, I found something that chilled me to the bone: connections between my own family and the Bells. It turned out that my great-great-grandfather had been a close friend of John Bell's. In fact, many of the original accusations against John had come from local families, including mine. They believed he had cheated them in business deals, but there was more. Hidden in old records and whispered family stories were hints that some of the Bell family's misfortunes weren't just the result of a curse, but of something darker, something the townspeople had tried to cover up. There were rumors that John Bell's family had practiced something unnatural, dabbling in things they shouldn't have. It was said that John himself had invoked the spirit that tormented them, not Kate Batts, as the legend claimed. That spirit had unfinished business, and it wasn't satisfied with John Bell's death. It wanted more. The unseen force. The more I learned, the more the activity in my house escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects moved, and once, in the dead of night, I felt a cold, bony hand grip my shoulder, only to find nothing there when I turned. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispering started. Faint at first, like the wind through the trees, but then louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, harsh and angry, but I couldn't understand the words. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening. The voice was coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than usual. "Leave it," hissed. I jumped out of bed, backing toward the door. But the voice followed me, growing louder and more furious. "Leave, or suffer." I ran out of the house that night, sleeping in my truck, too terrified to go back inside. The final revelation. I decided to contact a local historian, someone who had studied the Bell Witch legend in depth. When I explained what had been happening, she listened quietly, then asked me a question that made my blood run cold. "Did your family have any connection to the original Bell Witch story?" I hesitated, but then told her what I had learned about my great-great-great-grandfather and his connection to John Bell. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she spoke again. "The spirit doesn't just haunt the Bell family," she said. "It haunts anyone who had a hand in those events. Your family is just as much a part of this curse as theirs." The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket. The legend wasn't just a ghost story, it was my family's history. The Bell Witch hadn't come for me by accident. I was part of the same legacy of betrayal and darkness that had started this whole thing. And now, she had returned to claim another victim. The escape. I packed my bags the next morning, not caring about the farm anymore. It had been my family's home for generations, but it wasn't worth staying. Whatever dark secrets the Bell family had uncovered, my family was entangled in them too. I could feel the presence growing stronger each day, the oppressive weight of it suffocating. As I drove away from the house for the last time, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something standing in the upstairs window. A shadowy figure, too far away to see clearly, but unmistakable. It was watching me leave. The Bell Witch was real, and she wasn't finished. Not yet. To this day, I haven't gone back. The farm is still there, abandoned now, left to rot along with the curse that clings to it. I've tried to move on to forget what happened, but every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear the knocking. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. As if she's reminding me that the past never really lets you go. The stranger at the door. Jake had always been a light sleeper, but ever since he moved into his new house in the quiet suburban neighborhood, sleep had become elusive. At first, he blamed it on the creaky old floors, or maybe it was the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling. The place was big, built in the 1950s, with walls that seemed to hold whispers from the past, but nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary until the knocking started. The first time it happened, Jake had been drifting off to sleep. His body was heavy with exhaustion after a long day at work, his mind teetering on the edge of unconsciousness, when there came a knock, 3 sharp raps that jolted him awake. His eyes flew open, and his heart pounded in his chest. It was the middle of the night. He lay still for a moment, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. Maybe it was a dream, but the sound had been so clear, so deliberate. Jake pushed the covers aside and padded barefoot down the hallway, every floorboard creaking under his weight. He approached the front door, the sound of his own breathing loud in the otherwise silent house. He opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see someone there, maybe a neighbor in distress or a prankster messing around. But no one was there. The cold night air washed over him, and the street outside was still and deserted. The porch light flickered slightly, but the quiet suburban street was undisturbed. Jake stood in the doorway for a long moment, scanning the dark yards and empty road before finally shutting the door and locking it. Just my imagination, he muttered to himself. But the knocking returned the next night. This time it came at 3:13 a.m., a fact Jake would come to remember, because he had checked the clock the second the knock sounded. 3 sharp raps, the exact same rhythm as the night before. His pulse quickened, and a cold dread settled into the pit of his stomach. He waited, hoping it would stop. But the knocks persisted steady, deliberate. Once again he went to the door, heart pounding in his chest. The same result, no one was there. The third night was worse. Jake had stayed up late, working at his computer, trying to distract himself from the growing sense of unease that had settled over him. The knock came right on schedule, just after 3 in the morning. This time the knocks were louder, more insistent. Jake jumped to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins. He sprinted to the door and yanked it open in one swift motion, hoping to catch whoever was out there in the act. But the porch was empty. "Who the hell is doing this?" he whispered to himself, a sense of helplessness washing over him. Jake didn't sleep much after that. The days passed in a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. He told his coworkers about the strange knocking, and they laughed it off, suggesting everything from pranksters to raccoons. But Jake knew it wasn't an animal, it was too precise, too human. By the 5th night, he had convinced himself that someone was watching him, toying with him. The knocking had become more aggressive, rattling the door in its frame. He stayed awake all night, staring at the door, waiting. When the knocking came, he didn't answer it. He couldn't bear to open the door again, only to find nothing but emptiness on the other side. But the knocking didn't stop. Every night, like clockwork, it continued. The raps grew louder, more demanding. Jake couldn't concentrate at work anymore. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the stranger at the door, the invisible presence that tormented him night after night. He considered installing cameras, calling the police, but deep down he knew no one would believe him. There was no evidence, nothing to show for the sleepless nights but his own growing paranoia. One evening, as Jake sat in his living room staring blankly at the flickering TV screen, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his friend Eric. "Hey, how's the new place? You alive?" Jake hesitated before responding. He hadn't told anyone the full extent of what was happening. It sounded too insane, but maybe Eric would take him seriously. "It's ... weird. I keep hearing knocking at my door in the middle of the night, but no one's ever there." A few seconds passed before Eric replied. "Dude, it's probably some kid playing a prank. Relax." Jake clenched his jaw in frustration. That was the problem, no one took it seriously. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more. Something dark. He didn't reply to Eric. Instead, he sat in silence, the shadows in the room growing longer as night fell. Later that night, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the knocking returned. This time it was louder than ever before. It echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls, shaking Jake to his core. His body tensed, his muscles rigid with fear. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to know. He had to end this. Slowly, he rose from his bed and made his way to the front door. The knocking continued, unrelenting. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His heart pounded in his ears, his breath shallow and quick. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back, but he couldn't. He had to know what was on the other side. With a trembling hand, Jake unlocked the door and yanked it open. Nothing. The empty porch greeted him once again. His heart sank, a mix of relief and confusion swirling in his mind. But something was different this time. The air outside felt ... wrong. Thick. Ominous. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he felt a chill crawl down his spine. Jake stepped out onto the porch, scanning the dark street. Everything was still, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As he turned to go back inside, a sound made him freeze in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the shadows at the far end of the street. Jake's breath hitched in his throat as he squinted into the darkness. A figure emerged, walking slowly toward him. It was a man tall, with a shadowy face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed to melt into the night around him. The stranger walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Jake's pulse quickened and his mind raced. He wanted to move, to run, to slam the door and lock it behind him, but he was frozen in place. The figure drew closer, each step louder, more menacing. Suddenly the knocking started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the front door. It was inside the house. Jake's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The knocks were now behind him, echoing from deep within the walls of his own home. Panic surged through him. He whipped around, slamming the door shut, his heart pounding in his chest. The knocks grew louder, faster, reverberating through the entire house. His vision blurred, and he staggered backward, the walls seeming to close in around him. The knocking was relentless now, coming from every direction, inside and outside, growing in intensity until it was deafening. Jake clutched his head, sinking to his knees, screaming into the void as the sound consumed him. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The house fell silent. Jake sat there, trembling, his mind shattered, his body drenched in sweat. Slowly he rose to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. He stumbled toward the door, barely able to breathe. His hand hovered over the knob for a moment before he hesitantly opened it once more. The street was empty. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained, thick and suffocating. Jake stood there, staring out into the dark, knowing that the knocking would return. And when it did, he would be waiting, because now he understood whatever was knocking, it wasn't outside. It was inside, and it had always been inside. And next time, it wouldn't stop at knocking.